Hey everyone, it's Jillian. In today's video, we're going to tell you how we built a 1,200 gallon indoor pond in the back of our shop.
Hey y'all, my name is Philip. I'm the one you can see in this video. Built the tank for Aquarium Outfitters. I'm a friend of the store. And the best way to begin this process, if you're thinking about a build of your own, is to make sure you have your glass first. Your viewing panels determine everything else. So how big the viewing panel can be, the thickness of the glass determines the dimensions of the tank, which also determines the size and gallon size of the tank as a whole. So having those first is very important. We actually made some changes, had some learning experiences in this build. We decided to have 4 viewing panels, 2 in the front and 1 on either side. You can see us right in the first minute or 2 of the video here, go ahead and laying out the foundation of the tank, where it's going to sit, get an idea, make sure you don't have it too close to the wall, and we're trying to think everything through in advance so that if we ever want to come back or change anything, for example, is it filtered by canisters, a sump on the floor on the side, an overhead sump, that we can make sure that this build is compatible with all of those things if the guys at the store ever choose to change what kind of fish they want in the tank, what style of filtration they need. Now you can start to see in the framing of the tank where the windows are. We've got 2 larger viewing panels in the front and, like I said, 2 on the side. Later in the video you'll see that we ended up actually changing the side of the viewing panels on the side. So you can change and make them smaller. You can't necessarily add bigger viewing panels halfway through the build, but you can make it smaller. We're putting long beams across the front, back, and sides of the tank. It's very important. You want to make sure you have one solid piece of wood going all the way left to right on the front and back walls of the tank. That's going to help give it structure and help hold everything together. While we're building these pillars, you can see that pillar that's there in the middle of the viewing panels and on each corner of the tank. There are screws holding every single 2x6 together, as well as longer lag bolts holding every 3 boards together, as well as 10 and 12-inch wood lags holding multiple boards all together from every angle possible. You want to make sure when you're playing with this much water weight that you have this tank. I go by a safety factor of 3. So this tank is estimated to hold 1,200 gallons when completely full. I want it to hold 30,000 pounds. 1,200 gallons, about 10,000 pounds. Let's shoot for a factor of 3 and build this thing capable of holding 30,000 pounds of weight. That's the best way and safest way you can think about it. Now you can see us coating the inside with plywood. On the walls, we're using 3/4 inch plywood, and we'll use 3/4 inch plywood again on the floors, but we're actually going to have 2 layers of it instead of just 1. On the walls and the floor, you want to pick the best, highest quality sheets of plywood you can find. You don't want any cracks, you don't want any knots, you don't want anything that is going to mess with the integrity of the entire build as a whole. Now you can see us putting in the first coat for the floor. You can do the floor in a couple different ways. In a previous build, I've actually built the tank on a stand, but it was only 600 gallons. And I built the stand, put the floor of the tank on top of the stand, and then built my walls on top of the floor. In this case, with this style of a build being that it's so heavy, we're not going to even try and put it on a stand. We cut the floors of the tank so incredibly tight that we actually had to jump up and down and stomp to wedge that plywood inside the walls. So there is a really, really, really nice tight seal already just between the wood floors and the wood on the walls. Also, getting a nice, clean, even coat of either a deck paint or an epoxy on all sides of your wood in the tank build as possible is really important. Thinking ahead, you don't ever want water getting out of where it's supposed to be and rotting away at the wood of the tank, because that's going to weaken the structure and lead to a blowout later on down the road. You can either use deck paint or epoxy. Either one will work. In this case, we're using deck paint just to save some money. Now this is the first batch of epoxy. I'm using Pond Armor epoxy. There are other products you can use, but I'm more familiar with Pond Armor. when you first add your hardener, you can add some alcohol. It has to be highest concentration that you can get a hold of possible. This is 90 something. I think it was 99%. You want to mix just a little bit into the hardener, and that's going to soften up the hardener. Then you go ahead and add your other part to get your part A and your part B mixed together, already having that alcohol inside the softener. That's going to allow you some more working time with the epoxy. So if you did not use the alcohol, you're going to be pretty rushed on time and really struggle to get it all spread out evenly. Versus in this case, we need to put epoxy on the walls. We need some working time with this stuff. So having the alcohol already mixed in gives us probably twice the working time and makes it a lot more pliable and easier to work with. Epoxy is not like a paint. It doesn't just stick to a brush and go on. You actually kind of have to scoop it and lift it with the brush or the roller and get it onto the wall, and then spread it once it's already on the wall. Once you've done your first coat, you can go ahead and actually begin sanding it. It feels backwards, it feels wrong, but it's the best thing you can do before you add more layers of epoxy. You should always sand and grit up that top sheen off of the epoxy. If you leave that sheen, you won't get as good of a attachment on the second layer. You want to use anywhere from like a 120 to 180 grit sanding all throughout the tank. Only takes a couple minutes, it's pretty easy, and then vacuum and clean all of your dust and leftovers from the sanding. Now we're ready to do our second coat. We're going to go ahead and put our fiberglass in. Our fiberglass is going to hold all of our seams nice and tight. You want to go ahead and measure all of your fiberglass before you do your second layer of epoxy, or else you're going to end up with a whole bunch of dried up epoxy and only a couple seams done. You can get these cheap fiberglass, 4-inch rolls from Amazon. They're a couple bucks. They're not too expensive. Go ahead and get all your seams measured out and then start your second layer. And you're going to use a paintbrush and really, really lay it on thick in the seams. You're going to use an entire kit probably of Pond Armor epoxy to put in all of your seams. So go ahead and use that paintbrush or a roller or your hand even, and just layer and soak that epoxy down in that first seam that you're going to do. Take your fiberglass and press it in gently, but kind of get it into the crack and push it all the way into that seam, and then push down with your hands. Like I use the back of my hand here to, you can start to see that wet epoxy shining through the fiberglass, and that's going to create a nice watertight seal once you pile on some more epoxy on top. You want to absolutely drown this fiberglass in epoxy. This seam is holding your tank together. If this seam goes, everything's done for. You got to start over from scratch. So the more the merrier. Go ahead and lay it on really, really thick on all of your seams all the way around the tank. Here's that window change that I was talking about. We got an opportunity to use some different glass that was a little bit thicker, a little bit stronger, but we had to make the viewing panels a little bit smaller. So all we're doing is adding some more framing, some more plywood, a lot more epoxy, and a lot more fiberglass and sanding to make sure everything's waterproof. You can go smaller. It would be a huge struggle to go bigger at this point in the build, but it's a change we were willing to make because we want that extra added insurance of having some thicker, stronger glass. Now we're doing another layer of epoxy. In total, I don't know that we filmed it all, but we did probably 4 to 5 coats in total of epoxy. Again, the more the merrier. You can't go wrong with it, but sand every single time, and go ahead and do your layers pretty quickly. You don't want to exceed more than about 24 hours to do another coat. You want your previous coat to dry completely, but you do want to get it on there fairly quickly. You don't want to wait a couple days or a week to go ahead and add another coat of epoxy. It's best to do it in 24-hour increments. Now we're adding some cross beams to the top. We're using, I think they're either 10 or 12-inch lags. They're probably 12s here. Using 2 on either side of the cross beam and driving them down into the top and stud of the tank. These are going to work just like that plastic part that goes across like your classic tank sizes of maybe a 55 or a 75 or a 125. You're going to see that plastic rim going across the front viewing panel to the back viewing panel. These beams are serving the same purpose. They're just 4x4s and some big screws to help give it some more structure. Because this water is actively trying to push your walls apart. Now here we're putting some silicone on the glass. The more silicone, the merrier. We'll admit, definitely should have used more silicone to begin with. We used a ton, I mean probably 24 tubes of silicone, and then we went back and added another 24 tubes of silicone. You can't go wrong with it. Just go for it and don't think about how much you're using. It is always, always, always worth it to have as much silicone as possible, because if you're ever going to have a leak, assuming you've done your epoxy right and your seams right, any leaks are going to come from these viewing panels, and we don't want that to happen. It does happen, and it's almost unavoidable as the tank shifts and settles with the water weight. Remember, we're working with 10,000 pounds here, but the more you can use, the better, and you won't regret using as much silicone as you possibly can get a hold of. Using API, I think, makes some, Aquarium makes some aquarium safe silicone. Go ahead and go to Lowe's, just buy 100% pure silicone. It's also fish safe. You don't have to buy Aquarium's product. We used 5-gallon buckets full of water to give some weight to hold the glass up. You can use any form that you want of bracing. We used some wood bracing. We stood there and held it for a long time. Anything you can possibly think of that won't damage the inside of the tank to help hold those glass panels in place so that they adhere really well and you give that silicone time to dry. You do want to wait. We're in a really humid environment here at the store, so we've got to wait a long time for things to dry, and you kind of have to base that off your environment. We waited 7 days, 5 to 7 days, before attempting to fill with water. We went ahead and built some cheap, simple, I cut some 2x6s in half that we had left over, framed them up together, threw some netting across and painted them, just so the guys could have a lid that would keep fish in the tank and prevent anything from jumping out. Now this is our first shot of filling the tank. I'm 100% looking for leaks at this point. It's gonna happen. It's almost unavoidable. So keeping a really close eye on that water filling up slowly is very important. Find anywhere where you see the smallest bead of water, stop everything, drain the tank, silicone, sand, whatever you need to do to patch that hole, and let everything dry and start all over again. Now you can see we're successfully done. We added a bead of silicone along the floor to stop any water that might spill over on the floor from going underneath the tank and hurting the foundation of the wood. And we are all done. You can see it's filling up nicely, and I appreciate your time. Hopefully this inspired some of you to build, but it's also fun to learn and watch other people do other builds. Hope you enjoyed it.
If you made it to the end of this video, give it a like. Don't forget to go subscribe for more content on this indoor pond.